Hey everybody, it's Party Elite with the much-awaited Guide to Magic. As I delved into the topic, I realized it was much too large to include as a part of my beginner's guide, so I've decided to keep it as a mini-series with room to grow when new lores get released. This first episode doesn't deal with any specific lore, looking instead at the foundation upon which the magic system sits. We start with some basics and then talk about the different magic types. In the Warhammer universe, magic is harnessed through the winds of magic. When on the campaign map, different regions have a different strength to the winds of magic. You will see blue wisps of winds flying around. The strength of the winds changes based on campaign events, and it is good to keep an eye on the strength of these winds, especially if you rely heavily on magic in battle, or if your enemy might use magic against you. The strength of the winds of magic determines the power reserves, and as a result, the effectiveness of magic on the battlefield as a whole. Looking through the database files, there are 5 states the winds can be in: calm, weak, blowing, strong, and tempestuous, giving values of -50, -20, 0, +20, and +50 respectively. Either extreme is rare, though the middle grounds are fairly common. Once on the battlefield, almost everything related to magic is located at the bottom right corner of the screen. If applicable, you'll see icons to switch between lores, and depending on the character and lore you have selected, the circle will showcase the different spells. Depending on their location on the wheel, they will be assigned hotkeys that can be activated by pressing Alt and a number. In the center, you will see a slowly increasing number. This is your currently available mana. Each spell costs some mana to cast, and will reduce this number accordingly, of course. To the right of this circle is the blue bar that represents your power reserve. As magic is used, your power reserve and currently available mana are drawn from, and as your reserves get lower, the recharge rate of mana is also reduced. This means the more magic you use early on, the less you'll have access to down the line, unless you prolong the fighting for a very long time. This also means you can use your reserves up to a point that you will lose access to magic for the remainder of the battle entirely. I mentioned almost everything related to magic is located here. Outside of the actual casting and tracking of winds, you will often have character abilities located at the bottom left corner that help augment current reserves and recharge rates. You can also get various units that increase your power reserves and recharge rates, or reduce or steal the enemies. As you can probably tell, without reserves, magic casters can be useless on the battlefield. Use that to cripple your enemy or strengthen yourself. Spells each have their own cost to cast, effective time, and cooldown time. These are pretty standard as far as the mechanics go. Cost reduces your mana, effective time tells you how long the spell lasts for, if applicable, and cooldown time tells you how long it will take before you can recast the spell. There's also a time to cast value, which is particularly important for spells that don't lock onto units, Vortex spells, breath, and wind spells. This tells you how long it takes between giving the order for a spell cast and for the spell to actually be cast. And remember, any spell that has a double arrow on its icon can be overcast by double-clicking on the spell icon. This increases the effectiveness of the spell alongside the cost, and also results in a 50% chance of a miscast that can hurt your spellcaster. When a spell is cast, there will be a countdown over the icon with a blue ring filling around the circle. This is the countdown till the spell is actually cast. Next, the number will be updated, and another ring will form around the circle to count out how long the spell is active for. And finally, a countdown without a ring means you're looking at the cooldown timer. When it comes to the spells themselves, they're all classified into different types. Naturally, there are the different lores, and the remaining videos in this guide will pinpoint the strengths and uses of each lore and spell, but speaking in more general terms, the spell type tells you what they do and how they function at a glance. Augment spells and hex spells are relatively self-explanatory. An augment spell is one that strengthens your units one way or another, giving them better statistics so that they perform better in a fight. Hex spells, meanwhile, weaken enemy units, causing temporary stat damage which can give you the chance to overpower them or reduce the impact they have in an engagement. These two spell types must target a unit and typically only affects that specific unit. There are variants called Augment Area and Hex Area. These spells target a large area as opposed to a specific unit, though they can typically be cast on the ground by holding Alt. They can also be cast on a specific unit to lock onto it, and then affect the area around said unit. Oftentimes, for the best advantage, Augment and Hex spells should be used in the same area so they can turn a specific engagement to your favor, rather than spread the benefits thinly. Of course, this depends on the type of augments and hexes you have available. Reducing the enemy infantry's accuracy in a melee engagement won't do you any good, for example. When using Augment and Hex spells, it's very important to keep an eye on the effects and how they are listed. Percentage-based adjustments work differently than straight addition and subtraction. Be careful of the units you cast the spells on. increasing melee attack might sound great, but if it's an engagement where your units can't cause any damage, it's a waste. Likewise, for example, if you hex the enemy with armor reduction on a low armor or armorless unit, you've wasted a cast. Bombardment spells are powerful spells that come down from the skies. Once cast, the location is set, and the time to cast is typically quite long. This allows a quick opponent to dodge bombardment spells. With that said though, bombardment spells can cause severe damage in concentrated areas and serve a variety of purposes, including the ability to destroy artillery pieces in one strike in some cases. Breath and wind spells have similarities. They do not discriminate between friend or foe, and they extend for a fair distance beyond the location of casting. Breath spells are cast in a teardrop shape, which makes it possible to be a bit more precise and nuanced with them, and it looks like at their widest, they can get a little wider than wind spells. Both of these spell types start where they are cast, and travel in the direction the spell was cast. Keep in mind, this is the direction when the spell is cast, not when it is ordered to be cast. So be careful of angles. A carefully plotted spell can go through your lines instead of the enemy's if you move before the spell goes out. Direct damage spells are much like hexes, in that they target units or a specific area, except they cause HP damage as opposed to statistical damage. These can be great when targeting a clump of enemy units, reducing their health and as a result, their morale and effectiveness in combat, and they're extremely powerful against single large units or lords and generals and the like. The spell will specify if it's best in a certain scenario. Consider that a good guideline. Explosive spells cause an explosion that causes damage and disruption from the center of where you cast it outwards. These are best used on clumped enemy units as it will damage indiscriminately, but that means it can hurt your own units as well. It's important to note the explosion causes disruption as well. That can be great for creating holes in enemy lines and reducing enemy charge efficiency, but it can also ruin one of your charges if you set an explosion off just before impact and give your units nothing to charge into. Magic missiles are pretty self-explanatory in their function. You pick a target, and like a missile, this spell travels across the field to hit your target. Typically, these are best against large targets and individuals, though they do well against clumps of units as well. Keep in mind, these missiles are like actual physical entities. They must travel to the target, and any obstacle in the way will, well, get in the way. Some of these spells come out as multiple parts, twirling and homing into the target. It's possible for these parts to be blocked by terrain, trees, other units, etc. So often, you'll see fodder units being used to protect against them, and often it's best to fire them from a higher angle. Vortex spells are extremely unpredictable but powerful spells. Starting from where they are cast, these spells travel around the battlefield for their duration in complete random directions. Wherever they hit, formations will be disrupted, soldiers will die, and depending on the spell, hexes will be applied. Once again, these do not discriminate against friends or foes, and as a result, can affect your own units as well as the enemy's. Because of this, they must be cast from a safe distance, and are sometimes a complete waste of winds of magic when they peacefully travel off into the sunset without causing much harm. And that covers all the groundwork for spells and spellcasting. Naturally, each spell has its own nuances, strengths, and weaknesses, but the generic information gives a good starting point for this very lengthy conversation we're about to have in this mini-series. When dealing with a conversation as complex and foreign as magic, it is important to have a good foundation before diving headlong into the arcane arts. You need a proper understanding of the tools at your disposal, so you can use them most effectively. And that's what being a great general is about. As always, for more Total War content, including updates to this Magic Guide mini-series, make sure you subscribe to this channel, and keep up with me and the channel by following me on Twitter at _PartyElite.